I'm really pleased now. It's exciting for me personally to have Jonathan Turley here with us for this next session. Professor Turley is Shapiro Chair of Public Interest Law at George Washington University Law School. And as most of you know, he's a widely admired Fox Media contributor on a whole host of fast-breaking legal issues. He really comments on a gamut of issues, some of which I never even encountered in 3 years of law school. So we're really pleased that Professor Turley is here. Jonathan, before you came, or I think before you were here, I announced that because we've got such a jam-packed schedule, we're going to dispense with the long bio. You've certainly got an impressive one. We've got it in our brochure, and of course it's on your website. For our purposes today, it's most relevant that Professor Turley is author of the new book, The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage, published by Simon & Schuster. I have the book here. You see I've got it dog-eared on a lot of pages. It's a terrific book. You've heard me speak about our devotion to free speech here at the Free State Foundation, and if you also feel that way, this is an indispensable book about the indispensable right. There's so much that's important in the book, as you're going to hear from Jonathan in just a moment. I don't want to steal any of his thunder. I usually don't spend time quoting from acknowledgments in a book. In fact, I don't think I've ever done that before, but I love the last couple of sentences and the acknowledgement in Jonathan's book. You can tell that's reading a book from front to back, all the way through. And let me just read the last two sentences here because they really impressed me and meant a lot to me. This is a quote at the very end. I hope that this book will explain my own long and at times unpopular fight for free speech rights. However, my most cherished legacy is found not in these pages, but in my family members who have stood by me throughout this long journey. The only true limits to free speech are found in the inability to express the profound gratitude for those who love us unconditionally. I thought that was just a terrific way of putting it. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Turley.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Free State Foundation for inviting me. This is a great pleasure. It's a wonderful day to do this because free speech has been obviously much in the news. In fact, I just got back 2 days ago from Berlin after speaking in the World Forum, which was probably the largest collection of anti-free speech groups in history. And there was two of us from the free speech community, so Nadine Strausser and I were a bit outnumbered. But when I leave here, I'm going to be testifying in the Senate Judiciary on free speech. And so it's obviously a subject that is being addressed globally. We have but 30 minutes. I was afraid that the head of the FTC was going to monopolize my time and I'd have to sue, but apparently that is not the case. So in 30 minutes, doing the history of free speech is a bit of a challenge. So as Henry VIII told Anne Boleyn, "Fear not, I shall not keep you long." This book is 30 years in the making, and people have commented why it took me so long, because I've been writing in law reviews, litigating, and certainly writing as a columnist on free speech for 30 years. And the reason is I didn't want to just write another free speech book. I wanted to try to figure out why we're still struggling with free speech. And in fact, as we go back in history now, I want to note that, even though I'm sandwiched between the World Forum and the Senate in this speech, and there's lots of contemporary issues that are raging in those two locations, nothing will get resolved. Because, and this really came out in Berlin, that nothing will get resolved until we can resolve what free speech is, why it is we protect it. And that's what took me 30 years until my wonderful editor, Bob Messenger, called me and said, Jonathan, I just want to introduce you to this curious fact about publishing, that you actually have to publish the book for people to read it. And that seemed like it made a lot of sense to me, and so I finally let it go. I actually have a second book coming out. This is how I succeeded, by cutting it in half. And on democracy in the 21st century. It's going to be coming out with the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence next year, the 250th anniversary. This book is about free speech, but it's also about rage. The subtitle refers to an age of rage. You'll note it's an age of rage, not the age of rage, because this isn't our first. Rage rhetoric, as I call it, has been part of our country since the founding. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. It was rage. And how we deal with rage rhetoric, how we understand rage rhetoric, is vital to this book. The problem is that the problem with rage rhetoric is not the rhetoric itself. 99% of it is harmless. The problem is that governments use rage rhetoric for what I call state rage. They use rage rhetoric to crack down on free speech, to use it as a way to silence others, usually silencing their own critics. So we are most certainly living in an age of rage. It's all around us. And rage is a very odd thing. It's liberating. It's contagious. And what people won't admit is that they like it. They like it because it allows them to do things and say things that they would not ordinarily say and do. That's why they like it. And we see it on both sides. No party, no political viewpoint is immune. What's different about this period, and the book looks at the personalities and periods that have shaped our understanding of free speech, is that we've never seen an anti-free speech movement like the one we're facing today. Quite frankly, before Elon Musk bought Twitter, we were on the ropes. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Free speech isn't a free fall in Europe. That was abundantly clear in Berlin. And the fact is that we've never seen a sort of a coalition or alliance like this before of corporations, the government, media, and academia. Two of those have usually been champions for free speech, and they have not been. And it has thrown us back on our heels, and we've lost ground. And the idea of regulating disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, my favorite is malinformation, is nothing new. I've testified over 100 times in Congress, and often on free speech or constitutional law issues. And members constantly tell me, we're just trying to combat these new threats. And that's the odd thing about free speech. It's easier to admire free speech from a distance. It's much harder to do it in your own time. If I mention the McCarthy period and blacklisting and censorship, people are appalled. They said, how could we let that happen? And then you say, well, how about the blacklisting and censorship and throttling that goes on today? And they go, well, that's different, because we're trying to protect the public from disinformation. What this book notes is that many of these terms are not new. Many of these terms were actually used at the beginning of the Republic. Things like fake news was used at the beginning of the Republic. It's the same voices. They're saying the same thing. Every generation thinks that they are unique, that their problems give them a license to silence others. Now, this book's title is meant to get you to think about this problem because it comes from one of the great civil libertarians, Louis Brandeis. And it comes from the Whitney case. And in that case, Brandeis writes beautifully about free speech and calls it the indispensable right. But the reason I use it as a title is because in that decision, Brandeis and Holmes signed off on the conviction of Charlotte Anita Whitney, a communist leader, who was arrested for speaking against lynchings. And what it's meant to suggest is that here you have this brilliant civil libertarian who's talking about the indispensability of free speech, and yet he made it every bit dispensable, tossed it to the side. The question is why? If it's indispensable, why is it indispensable? What the book suggests is that at the beginning of the Republic, we had a moment of clarity that was actually the most revolutionary part of the American Revolution. The greatest departure of the founders from Great Britain was free speech. That was by far the greatest departure, because Great Britain didn't protect free speech really meaningfully. It still doesn't. But what happened was absolutely bizarre. It seemed to spring from the head of Zeus, where the framers decided to define free speech in these sweeping terms to protect it from government regulation. And to do it, in my view, from a strong natural rights perspective. That it belongs to us as human beings, a gift from God. It belongs to us. You can believe whether it's divine or whether you can believe it's simply needed to complete us. But either way, what comes out of these writings is this idea that you need free speech to be completely human. You know, when I teach free speech in class, I talk about Locke and his natural law view of free speech. And much of the framers were in fact influenced by Locke. This idea that we had rights that pre-existed government, rights that adhere to us as individuals, as human beings, hence the notion of human rights. If you view free speech as a human right, it changes the dynamic. It changes how much you can trade off if it belongs to people, not because they're American citizens or German citizens or EU citizens, but because they're human beings. Often I show my students this picture, which you will recognize as the center of the Sistine Chapel. And there's been much debate. In fact, more of my colleagues have gotten tenure off this image called the touch. Thousands of academics have gotten their PhDs on that image and what it means. Now, for the most part, it's people saying, well, look, this is God creates Adam. It is the act of creation. It's the spark of life. But what if it's something more than that? What if it's something more profound than that? You know, it was interesting, not long ago, well, I guess long ago, it's been decades, so I guess we could say that, there was a doctor that went into the Sistine Chapel. And he stopped as they were leaving, and he said to his wife, I got to go back. And he looked up and he said, do you see it? She said, what? And he said, the human brain. He said, what's behind God's image is the exact image of the human brain. How weird is that? I mean, can that be an accident? Because, of course, Michelangelo knew a lot about the human anatomy. He would cut apart bodies. That's what made him such a great artist. And this actually, that can't be an accident. It's the perfect outline of the human brain. So you could have lots of theories of what that means, of course. Some might suggest it's a secular hidden meaning. It was Michelangelo saying, you know what, with all this religiosity, you know, it's really about being human, right? What if it's something other than that? About that touch. What this book argues, and it looks at scientific studies, it indicates that we need free speech to be truly human, not just emotionally, not in terms of developmentally, physically. That when we've cut off human beings from being able to use free speech, they physically change. Parts of their brain change, right? The hippocampus actually shrinks. Studies of explorers cut off, prisoners in segregation. They physically change, and not for the better. There's something about human beings that requires us to project part of ourselves in the world around us. It's captured in the image of a starving artist, right? Like Van Gogh. Man is starving, and he takes the few coins that he has and buys canvas and paint. Now, surviving, sustaining yourself is the most basic of human needs. And yet, he bought canvas and paint. The need to project part of himself in the world around him was so great, it transcended his starvation. So then what does that make us? What does that touch mean? What if that touch meant exactly what Michelangelo said it was? He referred to the creator of man. What if God was actually creating a creator? What if being in God's image means being a creator? Right? You see it all around you. When I teach free speech, I walk around the classroom until I find a student doodling, and it does not take long. And I say, "Are you doodling?" And they immediately freak. They go, "No, I was listening." I said, "No, it's okay. I love doodling. I'm fascinated by doodling. I'm enthralled by doodling." Everyone doodles. People doodle in weddings. People doodle at funerals. They doodle with a boat and a goat. They doodle everywhere. Why? You do all these weird geometric shapes until they become just a blob of ink. You don't even remember what it looked like at the beginning. And most of the times you do it without even thinking. The impulse to create is so hardwired that we do it without thinking. It's hard to break down the human being, right? Do you know that we have 98.7% overlap in DNA with a chimpanzee? 98.7. Wow. We have 80% with a cow. We have 61% with a fruit fly. And we have 60% with that. Now, if we have a 60% overlap with a banana, does that make us sort of a talking banana or a banana 2.0? Or is there something about being human that is different? And what we have found through history is that there is. People like this, Phineas Gage, many of you probably remember him. He was the railroad foreman who was tapping. He used that tapping iron to set off explosives until he made a mistake and he sparked the explosives. He essentially created a cannon in the rock face, and he was a little too enthusiastic about pushing down the explosives. It sparked, and it blew that tapping iron, right through his head. Went through under his chin, came out the top of his head. The doctor was not in any big hurry. Dr. Harlow was told that the engineer just had a tapping iron blown through his head. So he didn't really rush. He figured this was just a paperwork case. He was surprised when he went there and found that he was sitting on a porch talking. And then he had one of perhaps the most brilliant moments in medical science. He realized that we had no idea what the frontal lobe does. We just didn't. We didn't know what any of the brain did. But he knew that that guy didn't have one anymore, or at least not a complete one. And it occurred to him that maybe they could figure out what that does by how he changed. And what they found is that all of the people that knew him said that he changed profoundly. He could speak, he could work, but they described him as becoming like an animal. It seemed to have blown away his humanity. He had a hard time with relationships. He had a hard time speaking to people about emotions. He was quick to anger. He was violent. He became something that sort of de-evolved. So when we look at free speech, we look at true heroes. And our true heroes are all of those people we've spent the last 2 centuries arresting, because quite frankly, our advertising is not as good as our record. We've arrested communists, fascists, socialists, unionists, feminists by the thousands. One of them was Whitney. She's a remarkably brave woman. She was at Wellesley College when she went on a field trip. They're supposed to be there for 4 days into a settlement house on Rivington Street in New York. She stayed 4 months, and she became a communist. She had never seen such suffering, such poverty, and she wanted to do something about it. George Bernard Shaw said that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. He said that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. She was an unreasonable person. I see a lot of unreasonable people here. So the question is, how could she be so right and a brilliant jurist like Brandeis be so wrong? Because that's what the First Amendment says. It's clear. It has never been stated like that before. It's never been stated like that since. Everyone puts a comma after that line and adds, as they did in France, that you had to conform. This is in the Declaration of Rights of Man. You have this, and then there's a comma, and said as long as you're in compliance with federal law. But we didn't. We wrote it that way. I tend to agree with Hugo Black, when he says, I read no law abridging to mean no law abridging. And yet, we changed. Because of hypocrites like John Adams, perhaps the greatest hypocrite ever to sit in the office, who became everything he fought against in the Revolution, and used the Alien Sedition Acts to arrest his opponents. Jefferson was better. He pardoned all the people convicted under Adams, but of course they were all Jeffersonians. And then but he did prosecute some for sedition. So he was not blameless. James Madison was probably the best, and my students will laugh because they say I can't speak for more than 20 minutes without talking about James Madison. But give me a break. He just had his birthday, so let's give him his due. The thing that struck me interesting is I read his piece in 1800, where he refers to sedition, speech prosecutions, as a monster. He was referring to his colleagues, his friends, and what they were doing in the United States. It is a monster. It's a monster that lives within us. And when we're really afraid or we're really angry, we release it on each other. Now, there are many that believe that the language of the First Amendment was never workable. I'm a bit of a dinosaur in academia. One of my colleagues is leading a movement to amend the First Amendment. She says that the First Amendment is too aggressively individualistic and that it should be amended so it can be balanced against values like equity. I don't view it that way. I sort of view it this way. And I will wrap up. I know I'm pushing you all. When Rockwell heard the Four Freedoms speech by FDR, he wanted to paint them, but he wanted to start with free speech. He surprised many people when he painted that. Not some heroic scene, not some framer. That was a neighbor of his in Vermont named Jim Edgerton. And the reason he wanted to paint him is he stood up at a meeting where they were going to approve a new school building, and everyone agreed. It was unanimous. And then he stood up and he said, I'm a dairy farmer. He was actually the great-great-grandson of a revolutionary hero. Now he was a small dairy farmer. And he said, I don't know if I can survive this year. I can't feed my cows. How are you going to pay for this school? Because I don't want to give up my farm. And I'm not alone in this room. We can barely survive today. How are we going to pay for it? And Rockwell was just captivated by this one individual standing up. And he said, that's free speech. The ability to stand alone among your friends. Now, Rockwell is interesting for this purpose because Rockwell was attacked endlessly, particularly by a New York journal columnist named Greenberg. And Clement Greenberg hated Rockwell. He was the man who discovered Jackson Pollock and helped move the abstract art movement of the United States. And he said, Norman Rockwell has decided not to be taken seriously, that his art is just kitsch, it's just cartoons. It was vicious almost every week. Rockwell never responded. He never did respond to critics until he did with this. It's called The Connoisseur, and it may be the single most eloquent rebuttal in history. It's a very large painting, and in the background is an abstract painting. And in the front, you see a well-dressed individual clutching an art catalog rather tightly. It seems like he's been there a while. It seems like he's looking, you can't see his face, but he seems like he's looking for meaning. Now, what was interesting is de Kooning was there at the unveiling, even more famous than Jackson Pollock. And when they unveiled it, de Kooning screamed, My God, that's better than Pollock. And he actually insisted the critics take a magnifier to look at the abstract painting in the background and said, that's one of the finest abstract paintings I have seen in a decade. Rockwell could paint it, but he wanted to paint something else. He said that he went through America and he saw things that other people weren't seeing, and he wanted to paint that. And he didn't think it was simplistic. An umpire yelling at a baseball player, a cop sitting next to a kid at a soda stand. These weren't simplistic to him. They were enormously profound. They were capturing something about this country. In many ways, I am undeniably Rockwellian when it comes to constitutional law. I believe the First Amendment is exactly what it seems. And it's not simplistic, it's profound. It captures something about us. So the question is, where does this take us? And, well, buy the damn book and find out. No, no, you gave me coffee. I actually had a croissant. Let me put it this way. It's sort of hard. Recently in Colorado, a woman came up and said, first, I really liked your book. Today when you speak, could you say something positive? I was heartbroken. And I said, really? And she said, yes. I sort of felt like Woody Allen when they said, could you end on a positive note? And Woody Allen says, I don't do that. But he said, would you take 2 negatives to make a positive? And let me give you 2 negatives to make a positive and we'll end. One is, it's not working. It didn't work. This anti-free speech movement had everything going for it. Social media, an enabling administration, enabling media. Facebook even ran creepy ads to get young people to embrace content moderation. It didn't work. It moved the needle a little bit, but it's hard to get a free people to give up freedom. The second thing is, of course, we do a lot of harm to ourselves. That's why we talk about Pandora's box. It was actually a jar. But you know what's interesting about Pandora's box? She was sort of the first femme fatale. And Zeus was extremely angry because Prometheus gave fire to human beings. So while he was getting his liver pecked out by eagles on the side of the mountain, he created the perfect human in Pandora and sent her with her jar, and inside was all the things we do to each other. All the things of death and poverty, animus and hatred. She wasn't supposed to open the jar right away, but he had made her too human. We're always going to open the jar. And so she released everything we do to each other. But most people don't talk about the last thing that escaped from the jar that Zeus didn't want to have released. And that is hope. The last thing out of the jar was hope. So when people ask to say something positive, I'll say this. There's a certain liberating quality to believing that free speech is a human right. Because you can't really kill it without killing us. It's in our DNA. You won't succeed in the anti-free speech movement because we're still here. And yes, we do horrible things to each other in ages of rage, but there's something about us that is quintessentially human, is that we always have a sense of hope that we can transcend our times and even ourselves. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, that was absolutely terrific. Thank you very much. You know, we're going to be talking today about spectrum and universal service and a bunch of stuff like that, of course, is very interesting to us here. But to me, this was really an important address, which is why I wanted to have you here. I hope you will buy the book if you're interested, and whether you do or not, remember those last couple lines from the acknowledgement that I said before, because that's an important part of what free speech means. So thank you very much, Professor Turley. I don't want and we're going to have you back as well, even before that next book comes out, for sure.